I need to tell you about the bravest thing I ever did. Not climbing a mountain, not starting a business, not giving a speech to thousands of people. The bravest thing I ever did was simpler and harder than all of those combined. I started over. At 42 years old, after 20 years of building a career, a reputation, a life in one direction, I stopped. I walked away from everything I'd built, and I started completely over in a new direction. New career, new city, new identity, new everything. Not because my old life was terrible. It wasn't. It was fine, comfortable, established, secure. I had spent 2 decades building it. 2 decades of education, experience, relationships, reputation. 2 decades that looked from the outside like success. But it was the wrong life. Not wrong in a dramatic way, wrong in a quiet way. Wrong in the way that slowly kills your soul while keeping you comfortable. I had built a good first chapter. It just wasn't my chapter. It was the chapter I thought I was supposed to write. And at 42, I realized I could stay in this good but wrong first chapter for the rest of my life. Or I could have the courage to close that chapter and start a second one. The chapter I actually wanted to write. Right now, you might be in a similar situation. You've spent years, maybe decades, building something. A career, a relationship, a lifestyle, a version of yourself. You've invested time, energy, money, effort into this first chapter of your life. And from the outside, it might even look successful. But inside, you know something is wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just wrong. This isn't the life you actually want. This isn't the person you actually are. This isn't the chapter you want to keep writing for the next 20 or 30 years. But you stay. Because starting over feels impossible. Because you've invested too much to walk away. Because you're too old to begin again. Because people will think you're crazy. Because starting over means admitting the first chapter was a mistake. Because beginning again at your age feels irresponsible or impractical or terrifying. So you stay in your first chapter, the good but wrong one, the comfortable but unfulfilling one, the established but inauthentic one. You tell yourself it's fine. You tell yourself you've made your choices and now you have to live with them. You tell yourself starting over is for young people, not people your age. But here's what nobody tells you about staying in the wrong first chapter. It doesn't get easier, it gets harder. Every year you stay makes starting over feel more impossible. Every year you invest makes walking away feel more wasteful. Every year you age makes beginning again feel more foolish. And one day you'll be 65, retiring from a career you never truly wanted, ending relationships that never truly fulfilled you, closing a first chapter you spent your entire life in because you never had the courage to start a second one. Think about what you're staying in right now. What first chapter are you still writing even though you know it's not your real story? What life are you living even though you know it's not your real life? What version of yourself are you performing even though you know it's not your real self? And think about what your second chapter could be. If you had the courage to close the first chapter and start over. If you could write the story you actually want instead of the story you think you should write. If you could become who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. My name doesn't matter, but my second chapter does. Because I spent 42 years in my first chapter building the wrong life. Becoming the wrong version of myself. Writing a story I didn't want to live until I realized having the courage to start over wasn't giving up on my life. It was finally starting my life. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why people stay in their wrong first chapters. I'm going to reveal what happened when I had the courage to close mine and start over. I'm going to share the specific lessons I learned from beginning again at 42, and most importantly, I'm going to give you the exact framework to start your own second chapter. But I need you to be ready for something difficult. Starting over means admitting your first chapter wasn't right. It means acknowledging that you've been living the wrong story. It means accepting that you need to begin again, and that admission is painful. Are you ready for that pain? Are you ready to close your first chapter? Are you ready to start over? Then let's begin, because you deserve a second chapter, and having the courage to start one is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Let me take you to the moment I realized I needed a second chapter. I was 42 years old, sitting in my office at the law firm where I'd worked for 18 years. I was a partner. I had a corner office. I made excellent money. I had prestige, respect, security. I also hated every single day. I'd hated it for at least 10 years, maybe longer. But I'd convinced myself it was fine. This was my career. I'd spent 7 years in law school and 15 years building my practice. I was successful. I should be grateful. Lots of people would love to have my position. But on this particular day, I was reviewing a contract for a client, and I had this thought that changed everything. I have maybe 25 more working years. If I stay in this career, I will spend 25 more years doing work I hate. 25 years of every Monday morning dreading the week. 25 years of every Sunday night feeling anxious about Monday. 25 years of performing a life I don't want. That thought was devastating, because I saw clearly I was in the wrong first chapter, and I had been for years, and if I didn't change, I'd stay in this wrong chapter until I retired. But changing felt impossible, because I'd invested so much in this chapter. Let me show you the specific reasons I stayed in my wrong first chapter for so long. Because these are the exact reasons you're staying in yours. Reason 1, sunk cost fallacy. I had invested 20 years in becoming a lawyer, 7 years of education, 15 years building my practice, hundreds of thousands of dollars, countless hours, enormous effort. Walking away felt like admitting all that investment was wasted. I told myself, you've spent 20 years building this career. You can't throw that away. You have to keep going. Otherwise, all that time and money was for nothing. But this is the sunk cost fallacy. The time and money were already spent. They were gone whether I stayed or left. Staying in the wrong career for another 25 years to justify the 20 years already invested wasn't wisdom. It was throwing good years after bad. Reason 2, identity investment. I wasn't just a lawyer, I had become a lawyer. Attorney was my identity. It was how I introduced myself, how others saw me, how I saw myself. Walking away from the career meant walking away from the identity, and that felt like losing myself. I told myself, this is who you are. You're a lawyer. You can't just stop being a lawyer. That's your whole identity. But my lawyer identity wasn't my real identity. It was a role I'd been performing for 20 years, and that role was suffocating my actual self. Holding on to a false identity to avoid the discomfort of discovering my real one wasn't preservation. It was self-abandonment. Reason 3, social expectations. Everyone I knew saw me as a successful lawyer. My parents were proud. My colleagues respected me. My friends were impressed. Walking away would disappoint all of them. They'd think I was having a crisis. They'd think I was throwing away success. They'd think I was being irresponsible. I told myself, what will people think? They'll lose respect for you. They'll think you're crazy. They'll be disappointed. But I was living my life based on other people's expectations, not my own desires. I built a first chapter designed to impress others, not fulfill myself. And continuing to live that way to avoid disappointing people was guaranteeing disappointment in myself. Reason 4, financial fear. I made excellent money as a lawyer. Walking away meant walking away from that income. Starting over meant starting at the bottom financially in a new field. That felt terrifying. How would I maintain my lifestyle? How would I pay my mortgage? How would I save for retirement? I told myself, you can't afford to start over. You have financial obligations. You need this income. Starting over is financially irresponsible. But I was trading my life for money. I was selling 25 years of my remaining working life for a salary, and no amount of money was worth spending 25 years miserable. Financial fear was keeping me imprisoned in a well-paid prison. Reason 5, age anxiety. I was 42. Starting over felt like something people do in their 20s, not their 40s. I'd missed my window. I was too old to begin a new career. People would think I was having a midlife crisis. Starting over at 42 felt foolish. I told myself, you're too old to start over. You should have figured this out 20 years ago. Starting over now is pathetic. But this was just fear disguised as age appropriateness. 42 wasn't old. I potentially had 30 more working years. Starting over at 42 meant I could have a 30-year second chapter, but only if I had the courage to begin. Reason 6, fear of wasting the first chapter. If I walked away from law, it would mean my entire first chapter was a mistake. 20 years wasted, wrong education, wrong career, wrong life. That admission felt devastating. I told myself, if you start over, you're admitting your entire adult life was wrong. You're admitting you wasted 20 years. That's too painful to face. But my first chapter wasn't wasted. It taught me what I didn't want. It showed me who I wasn't. It provided financial stability while I figured things out. The first chapter didn't have to be perfect to have value. And holding on to the wrong chapter to avoid admitting it was wrong guaranteed a wrong second chapter too. Reason 7, uncertainty about what comes next. Even if I walked away from law, I didn't know what I'd do instead. I didn't have a clear alternative. I just knew I didn't want what I had. But leaving something known for something unknown felt reckless. I told myself, you can't leave until you know exactly what you're going to do instead. You need a plan. You need certainty. You can't just jump. But this was just another excuse to stay. I was demanding certainty before change, when certainty isn't possible before change. I was waiting for the perfect, clear alternative when clarity comes from action, not before it. Reason 8, comfort and security. Despite hating my work, my life was comfortable and secure. I had routines, I had stability, I knew what to expect. Starting over meant disrupting all of that. It meant uncertainty, instability, discomfort. And giving up comfort for possibility felt too risky. I told myself, at least you know what you have. Starting over might be worse. Better to stay with known misery than risk unknown misery. But this was choosing slow death over possible life. I was preferring predictable unhappiness to uncertain possibility. I was selecting guaranteed wrong over potential right. These 8 reasons kept me trapped in my wrong first chapter for years. Every time I thought about starting over, one of these reasons would surface and paralyze me. The sunk costs, the identity, the expectations, the finances, the age, the waste, the uncertainty, the comfort. And so I stayed. Year after year, building more sunk costs, deepening the identity, reinforcing the expectations, increasing the financial dependence, getting older, making the first chapter feel more permanent, increasing the uncertainty about alternatives, getting more comfortable with misery. Sitting in my office that day, reviewing that contract, contemplating 25 more years of this, I saw all 8 reasons clearly, and I saw they weren't reasons, they were excuses. Sophisticated excuses, reasonable sounding excuses, but excuses nonetheless. Excuses that were keeping me imprisoned in a first chapter I didn't want. Excuses that were guaranteeing I'd spend the rest of my working life in the wrong story. Excuses that felt like protection, but were actually slow suicide. And I made a decision. I was done making excuses. I was closing this chapter. I was starting over, even though it meant facing all 8 reasons, even though it felt terrifying, even though I didn't know exactly what came next. Because staying in the wrong chapter for 25 more years was more terrifying than starting over. That decision was the beginning of my second chapter. The day after my realization, I did something I'd never done. I gave myself permission to imagine a different life. Not just complain about my current one, actually imagine an alternative. I got a notebook and wrote at the top, if I could do anything at all, with no constraints, what would my second chapter look like? And I wrote freely, without judging, without limiting, without worrying about practicality or money or what people would think. I would work with ideas and teaching instead of contracts and law. I would write essays, articles, maybe books. I would speak publicly about things that matter. I would help people transform their lives instead of protect their legal interests. I would work from anywhere instead of in an office. I would have flexibility and autonomy instead of billable hours and partners meetings. I would care about my work instead of tolerating it. Reading this vision, I felt 2 things simultaneously. This is what I actually want, and this seems completely impossible. But I didn't dismiss it. Instead, I asked, what would it take to move from my current first chapter toward this second chapter? And I made a plan. Not a perfect plan, a starting plan. Step 1, financial preparation. I couldn't just quit immediately. I had a mortgage, expenses, responsibilities. I needed financial runway to attempt a second chapter. So I kept working at the law firm while preparing financially. I reduced expenses dramatically. I saved aggressively. I calculated how long I could survive with minimal income. After 9 months, I had saved enough for 18 months of basic expenses. That was my runway. Step 2, skill development. My second chapter, vision, required skills I didn't have. Writing at a professional level, public speaking, teaching, working independently. I needed to develop these skills before leaving the security of the law firm. So I started writing every morning before work, 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. every day. I wrote essays about ideas that interested me. I published some online. I practiced writing consistently. I also joined Toastmasters to develop public speaking skills. I started teaching a free workshop on weekends about career transitions. I was practicing the skills my second chapter required while still in my first chapter. Step 3, identity exploration. I needed to separate my identity from lawyer. I needed to discover who I was beyond that role. I started telling people, I'm a lawyer currently, but I'm transitioning toward teaching and writing. Just saying that out loud helped. I was acknowledging my current chapter while claiming my emerging identity. I also started introducing myself differently in contexts where being a lawyer wasn't necessary. Not, I'm an attorney, but I work with ideas and help people think about their lives differently. It felt awkward at first, but it was practicing my second chapter identity. Step 4, social preparation. I knew people would have opinions about my decision, especially my parents. I needed to prepare for that. I had honest conversations with key people. My parents, I know you're proud of my legal career, but I've been miserable for years. I'm making a change. I need your support, even if you don't understand it. They were concerned. They thought I was making a mistake, but they eventually said they wanted me to be happy. That conversation was difficult but necessary. Step 5, gradual transition. I didn't quit dramatically one day. I transitioned gradually to reduce risk. I went from full-time partner to part-time consultant at the firm. This reduced my income but gave me time to develop my second chapter work. I spent mornings and some afternoons building my writing, teaching, and speaking practice. I spent other hours consulting for the firm, maintaining some income. This gradual transition lasted 6 months. During that time, I built a small teaching practice. I had published 15 essays. I had given 5 public talks. I wasn't making much money yet, but I was building momentum. Step 6, the leap. After 6 months of gradual transition, I had developed enough second chapter work that I could see a path forward. It wasn't certain, but it was possible. So I quit consulting for the law firm completely. I went all in on my second chapter, teaching, writing, speaking, working with people on life transformations. Everything I'd envisioned. The first year was terrifying. My income was maybe 30% of my law firm income. I had to use my savings. I had moments of panic thinking I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years. I loved my work. I woke up excited instead of dreading the day. I spent my time doing things that mattered to me. I was writing my actual story instead of performing someone else's. After 2 years in my second chapter, my income had recovered to about 60% of my law firm income. Not as much money, but enough to live comfortably, and the work fulfilled me in ways law never had. After 4 years, my income matched and then exceeded my old law firm income. But more importantly, I'd built a life I actually wanted. I worked with ideas and teaching. I wrote regularly. I spoke publicly. I helped people transform. I worked from anywhere. I had flexibility and autonomy. I cared deeply about my work. My second chapter wasn't perfect. It had challenges, uncertainty, financial stress at times, moments of doubt. But it was mine. It was authentic. It was the story I wanted to write. And I learned several crucial lessons from starting over. Lesson 1, sunk costs are sunk. The 20 years I'd spent becoming a lawyer weren't wasted. They gave me financial stability, discipline, analytical thinking, and the clarity that law wasn't right for me. But they were gone, whether I stayed or left. Continuing to invest in the wrong path to justify past investment was irrational. Lesson 2, identity is malleable. I wasn't permanently a lawyer. That was a role I'd performed. Underneath that role was my actual self, someone who loved ideas, teaching, writing, helping people transform. Releasing the lawyer identity didn't destroy me. It freed me to become my actual self. Lesson 3, other people adjust. My parents were initially disappointed. My former colleagues thought I was crazy, but after seeing me happier and more fulfilled, they adjusted. Some even told me they admired my courage. People's initial reactions aren't permanent verdicts. Lesson 4, financial fear is usually overblown. Yes, starting over meant less initial income, but my needs were less than I'd convinced myself they were. I didn't need my previous lifestyle. I needed a life that fulfilled me, and that life cost less than the one I'd built to impress others. Lesson 5, you're never too old. 42 felt old for starting over, but I potentially had 30 more working years. That was enough time to build an entire meaningful second chapter. The only waste would have been spending those 30 years in the wrong chapter because I thought I was too old to change. Lesson 6, the first chapter has value. My legal career wasn't a mistake. It was the path I needed to take to discover it was the wrong path. The first chapter taught me what I didn't want, which clarified what I did want. Wrong chapters aren't wasted if they lead to right ones. Lesson 7, clarity comes through action. I didn't have perfect clarity about my second chapter before starting. I had direction and desire. The details emerged through doing. If I'd waited for complete clarity before acting, I'd still be waiting. Lesson 8, courage is a practice. Starting over required courage, but courage isn't something you have and then act. Courage is something you build by acting. Each small step toward my second chapter built more courage for the next step. 4 years after closing my first chapter, I was living a completely different life. Different work, different identity, different story, different everything. Not because circumstances changed, but because I had the courage to start over. After starting my second chapter, I developed what I call the second chapter framework. This is the system that helps you close your wrong first chapter and begin a new chapter that's actually yours. The framework has 7 components, and each one is essential. Component 1, the chapter assessment. You need to honestly assess whether you're in the wrong chapter. Many people are in wrong chapters but have convinced themselves it's fine. The practice. Answer these questions honestly. If I could design my ideal life with no constraints, how different would it be from my current life? Rate on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is completely different and 10 is almost identical. If someone offered me $10 million to continue my current life exactly as it is for the next 20 years, would I take it? If you wouldn't take unlimited money to continue your current life, you're in the wrong chapter. If I had only 10 years left to live, would I spend them doing what I'm doing now? If not, why are you spending your actual limited years doing it? When I imagine my life continuing on its current trajectory for the next 20 years, do I feel excited or dread? Excitement suggests right chapter. Dread suggests wrong chapter. If your answers reveal you're in the wrong chapter, acknowledge it clearly. You can't change what you won't admit. My assessment revealed my ideal life was a 2 out of 10 compared to my current life. I wouldn't take money to continue my legal career for 20 more years. I absolutely wouldn't spend my last 10 years practicing law. I felt dread imagining 20 more years in that chapter. I was clearly in the wrong chapter. Component 2, the excuse identification. You're staying in your wrong chapter for reasons that feel legitimate but are actually excuses. You need to identify them explicitly. The practice. Complete this sentence multiple times. I'm staying in my current chapter because. List all your reasons. Then for each one, ask, is this actually a valid reason, or is it an excuse to avoid the difficulty of starting over? Common excuses disguised as reasons. Sunk costs, identity investment, social expectations, financial fear, age anxiety, fear of wasting the first chapter, uncertainty about alternatives, comfort and security. Identify which excuses are keeping you trapped. Once visible as excuses rather than reasons, they lose power. My excuse list included all 8 reasons I discussed earlier. Seeing them written out as excuses rather than valid reasons helped me recognize I was choosing imprisonment, not protection. Component 3, the second chapter vision. You need a vision of what your second chapter could be, not a perfect detailed plan, a directional vision. The practice. Write freely in response to, if I could do anything in my second chapter with no constraints, what would it look like? Don't limit yourself with practicality yet. Just imagine freely. What work would you do? Where would you live? How would you spend your time? What would matter to you? What would you create or contribute? This vision gives you a target, something to move toward instead of just something to move away from. My vision. Work with ideas, teaching, and writing. Help people transform their lives. Have flexibility and autonomy. Care deeply about my work. This vision guided all my preparation and transition decisions. Component 4, the bridge building. You can't usually jump directly from first chapter to second chapter. You need to build a bridge. This is the preparation period. The practice. Identify what you need to build the bridge from your current chapter to your desired second chapter. Financial preparation. How much savings do you need for runway? Calculate it specifically. Skill development. What skills does your second chapter require that you don't yet have? How will you develop them while still in your first chapter? Identity work. How will you start claiming your second chapter identity while still in your first chapter? Social preparation. Who needs to know about your planned transition? How will you prepare key relationships? For each area, create specific actions and timelines. My bridge building took 18 months. 9 months of intense financial saving. 12 months of skill development in writing and teaching. 6 months of identity work and social preparation. This bridge made the eventual transition possible. Component 5, the gradual transition strategy. You don't have to leap dramatically. You can transition gradually to reduce risk and build confidence. The practice. Design a gradual transition plan. Phase 1, full-time first chapter, developing second chapter skills outside work hours. Timeline, 6 to 12 months. Phase 2, reduced first chapter commitment, building second chapter practice part-time. Timeline, 6 to 12 months. Phase 3, full commitment to second chapter, minimal first chapter support. Timeline, begin when second chapter shows promise. This strategy allows you to test your second chapter while maintaining some first chapter security. It reduces risk and builds momentum. My gradual transition from full-time lawyer to part-time consultant to full-time teacher and writer took 2 years total. That gradual approach made the change manageable instead of catastrophic. Component 6, the courage building. Starting over requires courage, but courage is built through practice, not found fully formed. The practice. Start with small acts of courage that move you toward your second chapter. Tell one person about your second chapter vision. Take one small action toward your second chapter this week. Spend 1 hour this week on second chapter skill development. Make one decision based on your second chapter values instead of first chapter inertia. Each small act of courage builds capacity for larger acts. You don't need enormous courage to start. You need willingness to practice courage in small ways consistently. Component 7, the progress tracking. You need to track your progress toward your second chapter to maintain motivation through the difficult transition period. The practice. Keep a second chapter journal. Weekly. Document. Second chapter. Actions I took this week. Challenges I encountered and how I addressed them. Progress toward bridge building goals. How I feel about the transition. This tracking shows progress, even when it feels slow. Transitions take time. Documentation proves you're moving forward. My second chapter journal chronicled 2 years of preparation and transition. Looking back through it during difficult moments reminded me of progress I'd made and courage I'd built. These 7 components create a complete system for assessing whether you're in the wrong chapter, building the bridge to a second chapter, and managing the transition with courage and strategy. Now you understand how to start your second chapter. Let me give you the exact action plan to begin closing your current chapter and opening a new one. Action 1. Complete your chapter assessment this week. Answer all 4 questions honestly. Rate how different your ideal life is from current life. Would you take money to continue this life for 20 years? Would you spend your last 10 years doing this? Do you feel excitement or dread about continuing this trajectory? Be brutally honest. Action 2. Determine if you're in the wrong chapter. Based on your assessment, are you in a wrong first chapter? Not a difficult chapter, not a challenging chapter, a wrong chapter. A chapter you don't want to keep writing. If yes, acknowledge it clearly. Write, I am in the wrong chapter. Action 3. Identify your excuses. Complete this sentence 10 times. I'm staying in my current chapter because. Write all your reasons. Then review each one and ask, is this a valid reason or an excuse to avoid starting over. Identify which are excuses. Most will be action 4. Create your second chapter vision. Set aside 2 hours this week. Write freely. If I could do anything in my second chapter with no constraints, what would it look like? Don't limit yourself. Imagine freely. This becomes your target. Action 5. Calculate your bridge requirements. Based on your vision, what do you need to build a bridge? Identify specific requirements in each area. Financial preparation, how much savings? Skill development, what skills? How to acquire? Identity work, how to start claiming new identity. Social preparation, who to talk to. Write specific requirements. Action 6. Start financial preparation immediately. Calculate how much savings you need for runway during transition. Begin saving aggressively now. Cut unnecessary expenses. Redirect money toward your bridge fund. Even small amounts matter. Start today. Action 7. Begin skill development this week. Your second chapter requires skills you don't fully have. What's one skill you need? Schedule 3 hours this week to develop it. Read about it. Practice it. Learn it. Start building the capabilities your second chapter requires. Action 8. Practice your second chapter identity. Start claiming your emerging identity in small ways. Change how you introduce yourself in some contexts. Tell one person about your second chapter vision. Start seeing yourself as becoming who you want to be, not stuck as who you've been. Action 9. Have one difficult conversation. Identify one person who needs to know about your planned transition eventually. Have an early conversation, not announcing you're quitting tomorrow. Sharing that you're considering major changes. Test their response. Build your capacity for these conversations. Action 10. Take one small courage action this week. Do one thing that moves you toward your second chapter. Research something relevant. Connect with someone in the field you're considering. Write about your vision. Take one small step. Practice courage in small ways. Action 11. Design your gradual transition plan. Write out your 3 phases. Phase 1, timeline and goals. Phase 2, timeline and goals. Phase 3, trigger points. Make the transition gradual and strategic, not dramatic and reckless. Action 12. Start your second chapter journal. Get a notebook. Title it Second Chapter Journal. Write your first entry. Current situation. Vision for second chapter. Actions I'm taking to build a bridge. How I feel about this transition. Commit to weekly entries. Action 13. Find one example of someone who started over. Research someone who closed their first chapter and began a second chapter at a similar age or later. Study their story, how they did it, what they learned. Use their example as proof that starting over is possible. Action 14. Schedule your monthly second chapter review. Block time monthly to review. Progress on bridge building. Challenges encountered. Adjustments needed. Courage practiced. Next month's focus. This keeps you actively progressing toward your second chapter. Action 15. Commit to your second chapter. Write, I commit to closing my wrong first chapter and starting a second chapter that's actually mine. I commit to building the bridge strategically. I commit to facing my excuses. I commit to practicing courage. I commit to starting over, even though it's terrifying. I will not spend the rest of my life in the wrong story. Sign it, date it. Read it when you're tempted to stay in the wrong chapter for comfort. Now, some of you are thinking, but what if I start over and it's worse? What if my second chapter fails? What if I make things worse by trying to make them better? Here's my answer. That's possible. Second chapters aren't guaranteed to succeed. But here's what's certain. If you stay in the wrong first chapter, you're guaranteed to spend the rest of your life in the wrong story. Attempting a second chapter risks failure. Staying in the wrong first chapter guarantees waste. Which risk would you rather take? Let me tell you where I am now, 6 years after starting my second chapter. I'm 48 years old. I teach, write, and speak for a living. I work with people on life transformations. I've published 2 books and over 200 essays. I've spoken at dozens of events. I work from anywhere. I have flexibility and autonomy. I care deeply about my work. My income is comparable to what I made as a lawyer. But more importantly, I love what I do. I wake up excited about my work instead of dreading it. I spend my days doing things that matter to me. I'm writing my own story instead of performing someone else's. 6 years ago, I was 42 years old, trapped in a successful first chapter that was completely wrong for me. I had spent 20 years building a career, identity, and life that looked good but felt terrible. And I faced a choice: stay in that wrong chapter for the rest of my working life, or have the courage to close it and start over. Choosing to start over was the hardest and bravest thing I've ever done. Harder than any case I argued as a lawyer, harder than any challenge in my first chapter. Because it required admitting my entire adult life until that point had been the wrong story. And it required beginning again with no guarantee of success. But it was also the best decision I ever made. Not because my second chapter has been perfect, but because it's mine. It's authentic. It's the story I actually want to write. Here's what I learned. Most people never write their second chapter. Not because they're in the right first chapter, but because they don't have the courage to start over. They stay in wrong first chapters their entire lives, building careers they don't want, living lives that don't fulfill them, becoming people they're not, writing stories they don't care about. And they die with their second chapters unwritten. Not because those chapters weren't possible, but because they required courage they didn't practice. 6 years ago, I was terrified of starting over. I had all 8 excuses: the sunk costs, the identity, the expectations, the finances, the age, the waste, the uncertainty, the comfort. Every excuse felt valid. Every reason seemed legitimate. But they were just fear wearing different costumes. Fear of change, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of losing what I had without gaining what I wanted. And I realized I could let fear keep me in the wrong chapter for 25 more years, or I could feel the fear and start over anyway. Those were my only choices. I chose courage, and my life transformed completely. Right now, you might be in your wrong first chapter, a chapter you've spent years or decades building, a chapter that looks successful from the outside but feels wrong from the inside, a chapter you know you don't want to keep writing for the rest of your life. And you're facing the same choice I faced: stay in the wrong chapter because starting over feels too hard, too risky, too late, or close this chapter and start a second one that's actually yours. Staying feels safer. You know what you have. You've invested so much. You're established. Starting over feels terrifying, uncertain, risky. But here's the truth. Staying in the wrong chapter for the rest of your life is the greater risk. Wasting your remaining years in a story you don't want is the greater loss. Dying with your second chapter unwritten is the greater tragedy. You're not too old to start over. You haven't invested too much to change. Your first chapter doesn't have to be right to have value. You don't need perfect clarity before beginning. You just need courage to take the first step. 6 years ago, I was 42 and terrified of starting over. Today, I'm 48 and grateful I had the courage. You deserve a second chapter, a chapter that's actually yours, a story you want to write, a life you want to live. Close the wrong chapter. Start the right one. Have the courage to start over. Your second chapter is waiting. Write it